In this video, we're going to see how we can load between our scenes and set up a simple UI system that we'll continue working on throughout our game's progression. All right, so we're just going to take this parameter by parameter and what we have to achieve with our mechanics. So following a loose outline here, and why don't we just start with our first one and make our exit door controllers. All right, so what we need to do is start out by creating an empty game object. We'll reset its value. All right, we'll call this uh, exit controller. Perfect. Why don't we give it a sphere collider? And I want to go ahead and kind of position it within here. I'll reset its position, but let's increase its radius a little bit so it encompasses the whole doorway area. Perfect. And I'm just going to reset its position values. So a radius of about 0.8 will be pretty good. And we're going to make this a trigger. So don't forget to do that. We're going to give it a tag. So let's give it a tag of exit. So after we make the tag, we actually still have to assign it. So don't forget to go back and do that. And we need to parent another game object. So this is going to be our spawn point. This is actually going to be where we tell our player to actually spawn in at physically. So we'll call this spawn position. We'll just parent it under that exit controller. And depending on which way this is rotated and faced is where our player will spawn in at. So we'll be facing the blue arrow and be spawning in at the origin point of our spawn point. But why don't we just reset its values to 0, 0 along with our character controller, right, or our exit controller right here. That way it's more of a template object that we can work with later as a prefab. Now we're going to create a exit controller script, but why don't we go ahead and make this a prefab. So I'm going to drag my exit controller down here. You can see it turns blue. All right. Now we're going to create a script that we're going to attach to our newly made exit controller. C# script, and we're going to call this exit controller. Pretty unique name. Just kidding. And we're going to attach it to our exit controller object so we see it right here in our inspector. And we're going to go ahead and just open it up inside of Visual Studio, and we're going to set up some variables and some light functionality so we can detect the presence of the player. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just delete all this stuff that's in here. What we want to do is create two variables: int exit number. This will be what door that we want to exit from and to. This will be how we designate that. And scene number. This will tell the game which scene we want to load when we interact with this exit. All right, and we also want to create a public game object, and we're going to call this spawn pos for spawn position. We also want to go up here and make this public too. These three variables will be touched on shortly. We'll create some more code that does it, but why don't we go ahead and see how that affects our script. So now we have a nice exit controller right here with three variables that we will set. Why don't we go ahead and drag our spawn position to our public game object variable there. Now we can get exactly at the position of our spawn point. And we'll visit what these two integers are over here as we create our code. We'll jump back in and set those up. But why don't we continue with our code here? We need to create a function that'll detect the presence of our player. So we're going to say void on trigger stay, because we want to detect the player staying within inside of our collision box for our door. And as you can see, it auto completes where we can get at what we are colliding with. And what we want to do in here is create a condition that checks two things. Um, One, if the other .game object, uh, the tag of that game object, so in this case, hopefully it's our player, so we'll put in the player tag. So if a game object collides with this function, with this object, and its tag is player, then that's a good sign. And we're going to do an and statement, and condition right there. We're going to look for player input. So not only does the player have to be inside of the collider, but he also has to be pressing a key, get key down, key code .e. E is a pretty standard code for that. And why don't we give our curly brackets? So now we have an if statement that checks to see if the other object is a tag of player and if the E key is being pressed on the keyboard. So that takes care of that. That ensures the player is inside of our door exit and he's pressing a button. And what do we want to do here? We want to call a load scene function. Okay, so we're going to leave that as a comment for now because we don't have the scripts to set that up yet. But what we could do is to test it, why don't we do a debug.log and say player has pressed E. All right, so we're going to go ahead and save that. And we're just going to test to make sure in our console window. I'll hold on Control and Shift and P to bring up my console window and Control and P to play again. There we go. Let me press Control P to get us in here. So you can see in my scene view, I'm inside here, inside the collision box. If I press E, our message in our console window pops up. So we do have collision with our game object and our variables ready to go. So now we're going to take a second to go ahead and set up our exit controllers in our scene here. Before I go ahead and start setting those up, I'm going to make sure that any work we've done to my prefab in the scene here is updated in my inspector. We'll do an apply all, and that'll update the prefab sitting in here to whatever we've done in our scene. So now we can grab this exit controller and just plop it down anywhere, like this, for instance. So I have my two exits here. So I'm going to drag one right at my door here, and I like to go in top view and then make it orthographic by pressing the perspective button. And I just want to have it kind of halfway in there. I only want maybe half of the circle. And then for here, we'll just bring it straight back to that door. And I'm going to go back into perspective and make sure I've got it nicely aligned. And then they're both at the floor, so I probably don't want to have that. See how they're both at the floor? So I'll grab both, bring them up about halfway, like so. All right, perfect. Now I actually need to position their spawn points. So I'm going to expand them and select the spawn points. And this is a pretty important part of positioning here. You may be set to global up here in our transform settings right here. Let's make sure we're set to local so we can see exactly where our spawn point's facing. So it'll be facing in the Z direction, which is our blue arrow. So if we spawn into the scene, we'll be looking directly at this door. All right. We probably want them to be facing the hallway or which they can exit. We probably don't want them facing a wall here or a door. We want them facing in the right direction to go. So I'm going to grab my rotation and just bring this around 90 degrees. If I switch over to my move handle, I can see exactly where that Z arrow is pointing, like so. All right, great. So there's that spawn position set. Let's get this one set. So again, I need to bring it out a little bit and rotate it 90 degrees this way. And I'm not going to try to be too exact, but that should be pretty good. Right in front of that door facing our scene. All right, great. So now I have my my exit controllers placed with their spawn positions. Next, I'm going to go ahead and contract those. Next, why don't we go in and set our variables. So here we have kind of like a red hallway here. And I want my red lit exit. And here we have a kind of bluish area. So red, I want to be kind of my exit one. So I want to exit from this red area in this level and spawn into the red area exit in the other scene. So what we're going to do is designate this red area as exit number 1. And this number will pertain to the red side in our other scene. Scene number is what scene we want to load. And this is a good time now to show us how we can add our scenes in so we know exactly what scene number to load. So we'll add those scenes to our build so we can understand what our scene number is doing right here. So before we do that, why don't we go in and set up the exit controllers in our other scene. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to go to my scenes folder, and we're going to do the same thing there. Okay, I'm going to do that real quick, and you can see me work. So I'm going to bring in my exit controller prefab, and I'm going to position them. So here we go here. I'll go in and fine tune them in a second. When can I get their general positions? So you can see I have a nice blue area right here with a door. So let's position that just so. Let's go into orthographic by clicking on perspective. And let's grab that exit controller there. Let's position it right inside that wall. That's why I'm kind of going up top. So I can position it inside the wall just so. And why don't we go in and now position it in the middles of the door. Press F to snap to that object. Then I'm going to grab both of them in my scene, and we're just going to bring them up. So I'm going to try to get a good vantage point, like so. All right, next, let's go in and set our spawn positions. Make sure we're on local. And again, we're going to position it out from the door. And we're going to kind of put it in the center, floating here, because that's where the center of our player controller will spawn. And as you can see, I got the blue arrow pointing down the area in which I should go. Not at the wall, not at that wall, not at the door. But let's give the player a break and point it to where we want them to kind of proceed. That's a good first impression of our scene. Let's select this spawn arrow and do the same thing. We'll bring it out and we'll rotate it so we press the move key, we can see where our local arrow position is pointing for this spawn position object. All right, great. So that's setting up our scene controllers. You know what? We probably also need to talk about our exit numbers. So see how we have kind of a red exit here. Remember in my other scene, my red exit was labeled 1. So I'm going to select this red exit area and consider that as exit number 1. And over here is my blue, and we're going to call this exit number 2. All right, perfect. And we're going to save the scene and load back into our first one. And we're going to show how we can add our scenes to our build so we can start loading our scenes in our code. All right, so to add our scenes to the build so we can actually start accessing them in our code, we go to File, go to our build settings, and you got to make sure you're in the right scene first. So I'm in my very first scene. I'll add open scenes. So you can see that the scene that I'm in is added, and we get an interesting little number here. That 0 right there is considered like the scene index. So for all intents and purposes, scene 01 house, which is the scene I built first, is scene 0 inside of Unity. And if you want to delete it, if you made a mistake, you can just highlight any scene in our build and press the delete key on your keyboard. But I'm going to bring that back. All right. So I'm going to open up my next scene, my shop. I'm going to do the same thing. We'll go to build settings and add open scenes. So the order in which I add my scenes is the order in which it populates this list of scenes in my build. And as you can see, these index numbers increase. So my first scene is considered scene 0, and my shop second scene is considered scene 1. And we can use these two index numbers right here, 0 and 1, and access them in our code to make sure we're loading the right scenes. So now that I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and set up the scene number variables. So let's look at my red exit, and I'm in my scene 2. So red exit is considered exit number 1. And then what scene I want to load is actually scene 0 because this is my second scene. I wanted to load back to the very first scene I built. And we can see in our build settings here, the very first scene I built is index 0. So that is the scene I want to load. So load scene number 0 is basically what that number does for us. And again, blue exit, it's exit number 2, and we also want to load the first scene, so we leave that at 0 as well. Why don't we go into shop and look at the exit controllers here. So here's our red exit over here. So if we want to set the scene number on this one, we actually want to load scene number 1 in our build index, because as you can see, our shop is considered scene 1. So just hammering that point home. And we'll also go to our variables over here. It looks like I forgot to make this blue exit number 2, and we want to load our second scene in our build index. Okay, I know that says 1, but remember we count from 0. So that's basically how we can add our scenes to our level, and how we can use those index numbers and access them in our code. So next we want to build our game manager. Our game manager is going to be our first class that persists between scene loads, so we can keep track of the progression through our game. And in this case, we need to keep track of what position we need to load in at on every scene load. So we're going to go to our scripts folder, get ready to make a script, but I guess we need to make our game manager object in our scene first. So we'll make a game object, and we'll call this game manager, like so. And our script right here, we're going to call it GM for game manager. All right. Let Unity figure that out. So we'll double click on it to open it up, and here's our game manager script. Now you might be wondering, why don't we just call it, game manager? Well, for some reason, Unity sees that as a different kind of script. You can see it assigns it a different cog. It's almost like an like imported. I don't know. So a lot of people get around whatever Unity's doing there. I'm sure there's a reason. I just don't know. So we usually call our game managers GM to get around that fact. So that's why you'll see game managers with that moniker. Inside of our game manager, we want to do a few things. We want to create a singleton logic for this, so it persists throughout every scene load and we don't get multiple game managers in our game. Why don't we go ahead and make this prefab? Before we do that, let's swing our game manager script onto our game manager, and then let's drag and drop that right into prefabs there in case we need to get access to it again. All right, so let's go back to our script, and why don't we set up that singleton game logic? So we start our singleton by making a public static variable of type GM, so this class. We're making a variable that references this whole entire object, class, everything associated with it. And we're going to call that instance. So it's a variable name instance, and we're going to set it equal to nothing or null. All right, then we're going to create a void await function. And inside here, we're going to set up some logic. We're going to say if instance, which is that variable name we just gave our game manager variable, if this does equal null, meaning if it's probably the first time the game runs because instance is set to null, then we're going to do two things. We're going to call this don't destroy on load game object. So we don't want to destroy our game manager object in our hierarchy when we load into a new scene. We're going to set instance equal to this object itself. So that seems a little redundant, but we're creating this persistent public static variable. And then we do an else. So if instance is already equal to something, that means it's probably an imposter. So we're just going to do a destroy the game object that is the imposter. And that'll make sure we only have one game manager object following us throughout all of our levels there. All right, we're moving at a pretty good steady clip. So we have our game manager persisting between our scenes, like so. What we want to do is start creating our load scene functionality inside of our game manager. And the first step we need to do is access some scene management variables or functions or functionality inside of Unity Engine. So we'll do a using Unity Engine dot scene management. So that'll give us access to a bunch of tools to load scenes and all that good stuff. All right, so after we get access to that, we're going to create some variables that will help us in passing out our player position and what scene to load. So we're going to say int, we're going to say past exit number, and we're going to make a past scene number as well. Let's keep it camel. All right. So those will be used in a little bit. We're just kind of setting up some groundwork here. Next, we're going to create a public void function called load scene. So this is going to be our own function here. Oh, that's not how you spell that, is it? And what we want to do is we just want to call on our scene manager that we now have access to with our Unity Engine scene manager, and load scene. Oh, that's kind of redundant. Load scene, load scene. I guess it could be fine because we're not going to be accessing load scene from the scene manager except for here. So if you want to name this something else like load this scene or something like that, you can. I think I'm going to keep with it to see if it has any problems. And what scene do we want to load? Well, this is looking for index number, the one we found in our build settings back here. So it's looking for one of these two numbers, right? Our scene indexes. So for right now, why don't we just load it into scene 1 so we can just test our load scene functionality, okay? So we're just going to go over to my exit controller, and remember when I left this comment called the scene load function? Let's leverage the power, and let's comment out that. Let's leverage the power of our global game manager. So we're going to call a game manager.instance.load scene. So now when we are inside of a exit controller collision and press the E key, it should call this function load scene that we just defined over here in our game manager. And right now all it does is load scene 1 in our build index. Why don't we test that? All right. So we'll hit play, and boom, we're in our second scene. But you'll notice some things happen. I get spawned right in the middle of the level, and I'm always spawning in scene 1 over and over again. You know, no matter what door I take. All right, so we got to fix that, but that's good news. We are loading between scenes. And I wanted to show you guys, whenever we press play, look what happens in our hierarchy. So let's pause that. And now we kind of have two drop downs in our hierarchy over here. Let's zoom in and get a better look. So this is our original scene with our controllers, but we have this new thing, don't destroy on load. And look where the game manager is. It's living right here in our game, in our hierarchy, in this new little thing that'll make it persist between loads. So if we load into another scene, we now have the shop loaded in, but our game manager still persists. All right, perfect. All right, so we have our singleton logic working. We have our load scenes working. Now we just got to refine it and make it a nice user experience. Okay, the next big hurdle we have to tackle is whenever we load into a scene, we actually need to be able to load into the correct scene and position the player at the correct entrance and exits of each level. I have a red side and a blue side, if you'll recall. All right. So what we need to do though is create some kind of functionality that'll run code as soon as a scene is loaded in our game manager. Once we can kind of wrangle that down, whenever a scene loads, we'll just be able to move the player to the right position, and that'll take care of that. So to do this, we're going to count on delegates to listen for a scene to be loaded and then to execute some code when it does. And we're only going to do look at half of this delegate system setup, but it's something that Unity has pre-baked for us as long as we're using our Unity scene management libraries that we've added here. So why don't we go ahead and see how we can subscribe to an event happening with some delegates. All right, so what we're going to do, we're going to call a private function void on enable. All right, and we're going to, underneath it, we're going to do a private void on disable. All right, and we'll come back to those. And then we're going to call a private void function, and this time we are going to create our own function name called something like level has loaded. All right, on level was loaded is depreciated, so eventually it won't be used anymore. So this is our workaround there. We'll create our own our own function that is tied to these delegates we'll set up to load our scene. And since we have a particular delegate system set up, there's going to be some parameters that we'll have to set up. All right, but for right now, we've got our skeleton set up. So to subscribe to our scene manager delegate, we're going to call up our scene manager class, and we're going to look at the delegate they have called scene loaded. They've already written this thing. All we got to do is make use of it. And plus equals right here, let me zoom in, is how we subscribe to different events. So an event is something kind of like a load scene that we'll do, I believe. Let's just call it one of our own functions. So as long as a scene loads, it's going to call this function right here. So we're going to subscribe to that function by saying load scene, or actually level has loaded. I actually was looking at this old one. This is what we want to subscribe to, and we'll hit semicolon. So it's a little bit of some weird syntax here, and it's angry at us, and I'll tell us why in a second. But why don't we go ahead and set up that same logic down here, dot scene loaded. So scene loaded is the name of the delegate variable they kind of set up, and we'll do a level has loaded again. Again, it's cranky. That's because if you know anything about scene loaded, that means then you'll know that it requires two parameters that will have to pass into it through this level has loaded function. It's kind of weird and fishy. If you want to learn more about delegates, there's some really quick and dirty, easy and dirty tutorials on the Unity website itself. But right now, why don't we just copy me? So the two parameters we need are is of type scene and load scene mode. We're going to call that mode. And now everything's happy. So anything in this body of code right here is going to be done every time a scene is loaded. Okay. So why don't we just create a debug.log right now just to tell us, hey, yeah, you've loaded a scene. Yeah, scene is loaded. All right. And then we'll kind of populate that with some functionality that we'll need. But this is great. Now we know when scenes load, so we can start positioning the player exactly where they need to be. Why don't we go ahead and test that functionality? So what I'm looking for in my console window is a message that says the scene has loaded. Yes, scene is loaded. So that's interesting, right? It immediately tells me that upon starting the game because, yeah, a scene just loaded, the first scene. So if we travel to this next scene, boom, it collapsed. But what we can see is now our debug message has procced twice.